I knew the words before I knew what they would cost. They sat behind my teeth like something sharp, something not meant to be swallowed. I could feel them there every time I breathed, pressing, waiting, insisting. Not loud, not dramatic, just present, like a hand on the back of my neck that never let go. There are thoughts you can entertain in private, harmless as smoke. And then there are thoughts that change the temperature of the room even when you don't say them. This was the second kind. It turned every silence into a question. I told myself I was being careful. I told myself it was smarter to wait, just a few minutes, just until the timing was right, just until someone else said what I couldn't. I told myself that if I spoke too soon, if I spoke the wrong way, I'd only make things worse. That was the story I rehearsed, over and over, until it started to sound like reason instead of fear. But the truth didn't need rehearsal. The truth arrived in small, ugly pieces. A look held too long, a sentence cut short, a sound that didn't belong where it was. The kind of details that don't matter to people who are certain, only to people who are watching something tilt. I could feel it, the tilt, not like a sudden disaster, like a slow shift you notice when you've been standing still long enough, like a floor that isn't level, like a plan that has been spoken aloud with confidence while something underneath it quietly fails to agree. There was a moment early on when I almost said it without thinking. The impulse came up raw and immediate, the way you reach out without permission when someone is about to step into traffic. My mouth opened, my chest tightened, the first syllable formed. And then I didn't, because the air around me wasn't neutral. It never was. It was loaded with things you learn to taste: expectation, discipline, the unspoken agreement that some thoughts are not welcome. I could feel the weight of listening eyes even when no one was looking at me. The room, wherever it was, whatever it was, had rules that weren't written down. Rules carried in posture and tone. Rules that said, speak when spoken to. Agree unless asked. Understand your place without having it explained. That's how it starts, I think. Not with cowardice, with awareness, with the understanding that the wrong words at the wrong time can turn you into a problem that needs solving. And in places like that, problems don't get sympathy. They get handled. Quietly, efficiently, with paperwork and sideways glances and a future that suddenly closes its doors. I wasn't important enough to be protected from consequences. I was close enough to see what was happening, close enough to sense the shape of it, but not close enough to steer it. I existed in that narrow space where you hear too much and influence too little, where you learn that proximity is not power, where you can be in the room and still be invisible. And invisibility has its own kind of safety. It teaches you to keep your face calm, to keep your hands still, to let your thoughts stay behind your eyes, to nod at the right moments, to breathe shallowly when tension rises so no one hears you exhale. I remember how ordinary everything looked around the edges, how routine can make even the wrong thing feel normal, how the world can keep its steady rhythm, the scrape of fabric, the dull clink of metal, the murmur of voices, while something irreversible gathers strength just out of view. Every time I considered speaking, I saw the same image in my mind. Faces turning toward me, not in curiosity, but in calculation. The brief pause that would follow. The silence that would not be empty, but evaluative. The unspoken question behind their eyes. Who were you to say that? And behind that question, another, colder one. Why are you saying it? I could imagine how it would sound. My voice, too small, too careful, trying to push against certainty. I could imagine the impatience that would meet it, the tight smile, the polite dismissal, or worse, the kind of attention that doesn't end when the conversation ends. So I tried to adjust the words, to make them safer. I tried to wrap them in questions, in suggestions, in mildness. I tried to make the warning sound like something else, something acceptable, something that wouldn't expose what I really felt. The certainty in my stomach that something was wrong. But no matter how I shaped it, the center stayed the same. It was a contradiction. And contradictions are dangerous when the room is built on obedience. There was a particular kind of fear that lived inside me then. Not panic, not terror. Something quieter and more corrosive. The fear of stepping out of line and discovering how quickly the world can turn hard. The fear of being remembered for the wrong reason. the fear of having my words outlive me in the mouths of others, repeated with contempt. I could feel that fear doing its work, tightening, settling, disguising itself as patience. When I looked down, my hands were steady. When I looked up, my face was calm. And somewhere inside, the warning kept pressing forward, as if it could force its way out on its own. It didn't, because I let the moment pass. And after the moment passed, it became easier to tell myself I had chosen silence on purpose. The structure around me had been in place long before I arrived, and it did not bend for individual doubts. Everything moved according to routine. Days were broken into segments that repeated themselves with mechanical patience. Orders arrived already shaped, already justified, already insulated from question. They passed downward through layers of authority, losing nothing as they went except the possibility of refusal. By the time they reached people like me, they were no longer decisions. They were facts. There was comfort in that, for some. Certainty has weight. It fills rooms, it straightens backs. It gives people something solid to stand on when everything else feels unstable. I watched how easily others leaned into it, how quickly uncertainty vanished once a direction was given, even if the direction itself felt thin. Once something was spoken with confidence, it became easier to stop thinking. The hierarchy was never announced. It didn't need to be. You learned it by watching who spoke freely and who chose their words as if measuring them on a scale. You learned it by noticing whose questions were welcomed and whose were tolerated. You learned it by seeing how often certain people were interrupted and how rarely others were. I existed somewhere below the threshold where confidence was expected and above the point where ignorance could excuse silence. That was the most uncomfortable place to be. Low enough to be replaceable, high enough to be aware. I knew how information moved. I knew which voices mattered and which ones disappeared into the air without consequence. I knew how quickly concern could be reframed as insubordination if it traveled upward without permission. I had seen it happen before, not dramatically, not publicly, just quietly enough to serve as instruction. Someone would speak out of turn, not angrily, not rebelliously, just enough to disrupt the rhythm, and afterward they would be reassigned, overlooked, moved to the edge of relevance, no punishment announced, no lesson stated, just absence where presence had once been. Those examples stayed with me. They taught me what was expected without anyone ever having to say it. The environment rewarded compliance in small, steady ways. A nod here, an approving glance there, the subtle relief of not standing out, the quiet satisfaction of being seen as reliable. Someone who followed instructions, someone who didn't complicate things. I felt the pull of that approval more than I wanted to admit. Around me, conversations followed familiar paths. Concerns were raised only when they already aligned with the prevailing mood. Doubts were shared privately, in low voices, and only with people who would never repeat them. Outwardly, there was cohesion. Inwardly, there was fragmentation, but fragmentation that knew better than to surface. When authority spoke, it did so with a calm that discouraged interruption, not because interruption was forbidden, but because it felt inappropriate. The tone carried an assumption of correctness. The words arrived complete without visible uncertainty, and that completeness left no obvious opening for objection. I remember listening closely, not just to what was said, but to what wasn't. There were gaps, small ones, places where a sentence could have turned in another direction, where a question could have been invited but wasn't. I noticed how quickly those gaps closed, sealed by momentum and confidence. Each time, I felt the familiar tightening in my chest. This is where it could happen, I thought. This is where someone should say something. And each time the moment slipped past, absorbed into the flow of procedure. The system didn't crush dissent outright. It didn't need to. It simply made dissent feel out of place, like speaking a different language in a room that refused to translate. It made you feel as though raising a concern would require you to stop everything else from functioning, as though you would be responsible for the disruption, not the issue you were pointing to. That burden mattered. No one wanted to be the one who slowed things down. No one wanted to be remembered as the obstacle when efficiency was prized above almost everything else. Time, after all, was always short. There was always pressure, always a sense that hesitation itself was dangerous. I absorbed that logic until it felt natural. I told myself that those above me had access to information I didn't, that they saw angles I couldn't, that if something truly mattered, it would already be known, already accounted for. I told myself that my perspective was incomplete by definition, and therefore unreliable. It was an easy belief to adopt, especially when reinforced by silence all around. When no one else spoke, the absence of voices began to feel like confirmation. If this were truly wrong, surely someone more qualified would object. Surely someone with authority would notice. Surely the responsibility did not rest with me. That thought was comforting. It allowed me to fold my awareness into the larger structure and let it disappear. It allowed me to become just another part of the process, another pair of eyes watching, another presence that did not interfere. But the awareness didn't go away. It stayed with me during briefings and pauses, during moments of enforced calm. It surfaced in the way certain phrases were repeated too often, as if repetition could strengthen them. It lingered in the tension I felt when plans were discussed as settled, while details remained unresolved. I could feel the system pressing forward, driven by confidence rather than certainty. And still I said nothing, because in that environment silence wasn't just safer, it was expected. The arguments formed slowly, as if they needed time to justify themselves. They arrived in my mind one by one, never all at once, each presenting itself as reasonable, even necessary. I examined them the way you examine unfamiliar terrain, carefully, cautiously, aware that a wrong step could expose something you weren't ready to confront. I told myself that doubt was not proof, that instinct could be mistaken, that caution, taken too far, could become its own kind of recklessness. I reminded myself that fear has a way of disguising itself as insight, and that not every unease deserves to be elevated into a warning. That logic was persuasive. It allowed me to sit with my silence and call it restraint. There were moments when the pressure became almost unbearable, when the gap between what I knew and what I was doing felt too wide to ignore. In those moments, my thoughts accelerated, racing ahead to futures I did not want to imagine. I saw consequences unfolding in vague, shadowed shapes. I felt the weight of them before they had names. And still, I hesitated. I pictured myself speaking. I pictured the words leaving my mouth and hanging in the air, exposed and irreversible. I imagined the room responding, not with outrage, but with dismissal. The quiet, efficient kind. A nod, a pause, then a return to business, as if I had spoken out of turn rather than spoken the truth. That image unsettled me more than open confrontation ever could. To be ignored would mean that I had risked everything and changed nothing. There were other versions too, less benign. I imagined being questioned, not about the substance of what I said, but about my motivation. Why now? Why me? What made me think I understood the situation well enough to interfere? I imagined my concern reframed as doubt in the system itself. Doubt was dangerous. It implied mistrust, and mistrust had consequences that extended far beyond a single conversation. It lingered in records and memories. It shaped how future words were received. Once you were marked as someone who questioned, everything you said afterward was filtered through that lens. I had seen that happen, so I began to negotiate with myself. Not now, I thought. There will be a better moment, a private conversation, a chance to raise it without an audience. I told myself that timing mattered, that speaking up was not just about courage, but about strategy, that a poorly placed warning could do more harm than good. Those explanations felt responsible. They felt adult. They allowed me to delay without admitting that delay was becoming a decision of its own. Each time the opportunity passed, I felt a brief, sharp pang, like missing a step in the dark. It startled me, then faded. And once it faded, I adjusted. I told myself I had simply misjudged the moment, that there would be another. But opportunities don't announce themselves. They appear and disappear in the space of a breath. And if you are waiting for certainty, you miss them. I waited anyway. I waited for a sign that my concern was shared, for a glance, a word, a hesitation from someone else that would give me permission to speak. Permission never came. Instead, the routine continued, indifferent to my internal debate. The world around me moved with the confidence of momentum. Plans were repeated, refined, restated. Each repetition hardened them, made them less flexible, less open to interruption. The longer I stayed silent, the heavier the silence became. It stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling like a fact, something already established, something that would now require an explanation if broken. I could feel the cost of speaking rising with every hour that passed. I told myself that if the situation were truly dire, the discomfort I felt would be sharper, louder, impossible to ignore. I told myself that the absence of panic meant the absence of real danger. But deep down, I knew that was a lie. The danger I sensed wasn't explosive. It wasn't immediate. It was structural, subtle. The kind that emerges from small misalignments and unexamined assumptions. The kind that doesn't announce itself until it has already taken hold. That kind of danger doesn't trigger alarms. It whispers. And whispers are easy to dismiss, especially when you are afraid of what it would mean to listen. I began to think less about the potential consequences of staying silent and more about the immediate consequences of speaking. That shift happened quietly, without ceremony. But once it did, everything else followed naturally. Fear, I learned, does not need to shout. It only needs to redirect your attention. By the time I realized how far my reasoning had drifted, my silence no longer felt temporary. It felt inevitable. The moment did not arrive with drama. There was no sudden stillness, no raised voices, no sense that history had paused to wait for a single sentence. It came the way most irreversible moments do, embedded in routine, wrapped in normality, disguised as another step in a process that had already begun moving. I remember the room tightening without anyone noticing. The decision was spoken plainly, without emphasis. Not rushed, not hesitant. It was delivered as a conclusion rather than a proposal, as something already settled, rather than something still open to influence. The words carried the calm authority of inevitability. As they were spoken, something inside me shifted. I felt it first in my chest. A constriction, subtle but unmistakable. My breathing changed. Shallower, more controlled. As if my body already understood what my mind was still resisting. I became acutely aware of myself in that space. The position of my feet, the weight of my hands, the sound of fabric when I moved even slightly. This was it. The warning rose again, sharper than before. No longer abstract. It had shape now. Clarity. I could see exactly where the flaw lay. Not in theory, not in hindsight, but in the present. I knew what had been overlooked. I knew why it mattered. I knew with a certainty that left no room for comfort, that this decision carried consequences no one in that room was acknowledging. The words formed quickly. They were not eloquent. They did not need to be. They were simple, direct, almost embarrassingly plain. A sentence that would interrupt the flow. A sentence that would force attention. A sentence that would change the temperature of the room. My jaw tightened as if preparing to release it. Time behaved strangely then. It did not slow. It compressed. Everything seemed to exist at once. The decision being accepted, the quiet movements of others, the faint sounds of the environment continuing as if nothing significant were happening, and alongside it all, my own awareness expanding, pressing outward, demanding action. I felt the fear immediately after. Not a thought, a sensation. It moved through me with physical clarity, a tightening in the throat, a heat behind the eyes, a sudden awareness of how exposed I would be if I spoke. I imagined the silence that would follow my words, the pause that would not be empty, but evaluative. I imagined the subtle shift in posture from those around me, the way attention would turn sharp and impersonal. I imagined the mark it would leave. Speaking would not undo what was already set in motion. I knew that. It might delay it, complicate it, force reconsideration, or it might do none of those things. It might simply place me in opposition to momentum that no longer tolerated resistance. The thought landed with quiet finality. I cannot take this back. Once spoken, the warning would exist independently of me. It would be remembered, quoted, judged. It would follow me beyond that moment, shaping how I was seen, how my presence was interpreted. Silence, by contrast, asked nothing of me. It required no explanation. It left no trace. The decision was repeated. This time it was acknowledged by others. A nod, a murmur of agreement. The sound of acceptance moving through the room like a current. The structure I had learned to respect closed around it, sealing the choice into place. I felt the window narrowing. I could still speak, but now the cost was higher. Now it would not be a timely observation. It would be an interruption, a challenge, a refusal to move in step. The distinction mattered. My heart began to pound, not with urgency, but with restraint. Each beat felt like it was pushing the words upward, urging them toward release. I held them back with deliberate effort, my muscles tightening as if silence itself required strength. No one looked at me. That, more than anything, made it easier. Invisibility returned, offering its familiar shelter. I could remain what I had been, present, attentive, unremarkable. I could let the moment pass without altering my position in the structure. I could preserve the fragile equilibrium I had built by never standing out. The warning lingered at the edge of my mouth for one final instant, and then I swallowed it. The decision moved forward. The room resumed its rhythm, and my silence, once a hesitation, became a fact. The consequences did not announce themselves all at once. They arrived gradually, unevenly, slipping into place as if they had always been part of the plan. At first, nothing seemed different. The routines continued. The same motions, the same schedules, the same surface calm that had made the decision feel so ordinary in the first place. If I hadn't known what I knew, I might have believed that nothing had changed at all. But knowing alters everything. I began to notice the smallest deviations, the kind that would have gone unnoticed before. Delays that were explained too quickly, adjustments made without comment. The way certain conversations ended sooner than expected, as if there were no longer time for uncertainty. Each detail echoed the shape of the warning I had not given. It was happening, not dramatically, not violently, just steadily, with the patience of something that no longer needed permission. I felt it first as confirmation rather than shock, a dull tightening in my stomach, a quiet recognition that what I had feared was not imaginary. The flaw I had seen was asserting itself, not as a singular failure, but as a chain of small consequences reinforcing one another. I watched it unfold from the same position I had occupied all along, close enough to observe, too distant to intervene. There were moments when others seemed to sense it too, brief pauses in speech, a hesitation before agreeing, a look exchanged and quickly withdrawn, but no one named it. No one slowed the process. The structure moved forward, absorbing the irregularities without stopping. When problems surfaced, they were framed as temporary, isolated, correctable. Each explanation bought a little more time, pushed acknowledgement further down the line. I recognized the strategy because I had used a version of it myself, telling myself that delay was not denial, that silence was not complicity, but time did not correct the flaw. It amplified it. The gap between expectation and reality widened until it could no longer be disguised. When the first undeniable consequence appeared, it was met with surprise, not because it was unexpected, but because it had never been officially anticipated. The reaction was not outrage but confusion. How could this have happened? Where had it gone wrong? I knew the answer. I had known it before there was language for what was happening now. That knowledge settled on me like weight, pressing down with every new development. Each confirmation felt personal, even though no one blamed me. Especially because no one blamed me. That absence of accusation was its own kind of punishment. I began to measure time differently, not in days or hours, but in moments when the warning would have mattered, moments that now existed only in memory. Each one replayed itself with cruel precision. The pauses, the openings, the silence I had chosen again and again. The cost of that silence revealed itself in fragments, in the way discussions grew more tense, less confident, in the subtle shift from certainty to justification, in the quiet recalculations that took place behind closed expressions. The structure that had once felt so solid now showed signs of strain, but it did not break. It adapted. It always did. And adaptation does not mean avoidance. It means survival at a price. I felt increasingly detached from my own presence. I was still there, still functioning, still performing my role as expected, but something essential had withdrawn. I spoke less, listened more. Every word I didn't say carried the weight of the one that mattered most. There were moments, brief, unbearable moments, when I thought someone might turn to me and ask the question I feared most. Did you see this coming? Or worse, could this have been avoided? No one asked. The system does not interrogate silence. It benefits from it. As the consequences accumulated, so did the distance between who I was and who I pretended to be. Outwardly, nothing marked me as responsible. Inwardly, responsibility pressed in from all sides, inescapable and unshared. I learned then that regret does not need an audience. It only needs memory. Each confirmation of failure tightened the knot inside me, not because it surprised me, but because it aligned so perfectly with the shape of my fear. The realization settled in slowly, without drama. The cost of silence was not abstract. It was specific, tangible, and unfolding exactly as I had imagined it would. The world around me continued to move, indifferent to my internal reckoning, and I remained where I was, watching consequences take form, knowing that my voice, once capable of interrupting this path, now existed only as an echo inside my own mind. Time did not dull the memory the way I once believed it would. It rearranged it. The details faded first, the exact order of events, the precise words that were spoken, the sequence that once felt so important. What remained was the sensation, the pressure in my chest, the tightening of my throat, the moment when silence stopped being temporary and became permanent. I carried that moment with me long after everything else moved on. Outwardly, life continued. The world adjusted, as it always does. New routines replaced old ones. New structures formed over the ruins of the previous ones, careful not to acknowledge what lay beneath. There was no ceremony marking the cost, no formal reckoning, just the quiet understanding that something had gone wrong, and that it was now part of the past. The past, I learned, does not stay where you leave it. It follows you into places where it does not belong, into quiet rooms, into pauses between thoughts, into moments of calm that should have felt earned but never quite did. It surfaced when I least expected it, not as a replay but as a presence, a steady reminder of what had been withheld. I thought at first that guilt would feel louder, that it would announce itself with accusation or demand some form of punishment. Instead, it settled into me gradually, indistinguishable from who I was becoming. It did not shout, it waited. It allowed me to function, to speak, to exist, while quietly reshaping the way I understood myself. I began to measure my life against that moment. Not consciously, not deliberately, but every choice carried its shadow. Every hesitation felt heavier. Every silence felt suspect. I found myself questioning not just what I did, but why I didn't do what I hadn't done then. There was no redemption in that reflection, no lesson neatly learned, no clarity gained, only the recognition that some things once withheld cannot be offered later. Words have a time when they matter. Miss that time, and they lose their power, not because they were wrong, but because they arrived too late. I understood then that the fear I felt had not protected me. It had preserved my position, my anonymity, my safety, but it had also preserved the outcome I dreaded. It had ensured that the path I saw but did not challenge would unfold exactly as it was allowed to. I do not tell this story to absolve myself. There is no absolution in it. I tell it because the silence did not end when the moment passed. It became something I carried, something that shaped how I remembered everything that came after. It taught me that restraint, when rooted in fear, is not neutrality. It is participation without fingerprints. Even now, the memory does not accuse me. It doesn't need to. It simply exists, unchanged, unresolved, immune to time, reminding me that the most enduring consequence was not what happened out there, but what remained unspoken within me. The fear that kept me quiet never left. It just learned to live inside my voice.